So hello everyone, welcome back from lunch. I hope you're all well fed and raring to go for the afternoon. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this session on learning creatively and critically about climate education. Obviously, the summit looks at the role of creativity in education in some of the most pressing issues of our time. So we wanted to have this panel particularly. We were talking yesterday about the pedagogical resources that we have produced at the OECD, and we did last year release a suite of lesson plans that deal with climate education. So for example, I have one here, how is human activity and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere changing our oceans? And it's a primary lesson plan in which students do some kind of inquiring and experiments around carbon dioxide and acidity, and then they look at the effect of acidity on marine life, and then they look at some existing kind of geo-engineering initiatives around acidification in the oceans, and they discuss the kind of respective merits and drawbacks of those possible initiatives and solutions. So there's a whole suite of those that are available on the web and on the app that we were talking about yesterday, so we encourage you to go and check those out. But today, for this panel, we really wanted to talk to people that are really grappling with this issue on the ground in schools internationally, but also thinking about how to take climate education to scale and the role of creativity and critical thinking within that. So I'm really pleased to be joined by a great panel. I have Lennart Kuntze here, who is the inaugural head of climate education and leadership at Teach for All. He's worked in climate change and environmental sustainability for over 10 years, including at the UN Environment Programme, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and at Harvard University. And his passion is working with many of the 14,000 teachers and 90,000 alumni in the Teach for All network to advance climate education globally. And I'll just introduce them in turn. So we also have Simon Klein, who's a science officer and educator in the Office for Climate Education, which is a Category 2 centre from UNESCO. And he holds a PhD in bee ecology and now works empowering teachers around the globe with the OECD to teach climate change. And his missions range from producing pedagogical resources, teacher development sessions, research action projects, and educational policies advocacy. And then we're also really happy to be joined by Laure Siefert, who teaches at DSA Boulogne on a master's degree of graphic design and multimedia storytelling. And I think she's worked on some of the projects with Simon and the OCE, so I'm sure you'll tell us more about that. So maybe we start with you, Simon, then. Obviously, you come from the OCE. You work to support quality climate change education in classrooms around the world. So what role do you think supporting student creativity and critical thinking plays in that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Cassie. And I'm very pleased to be in front of you guys to talk a bit about that and how actually, climate change education can gain a lot from creativity and critical thinking. And I shall start with a small analogy that I kind of like to say and to use to introduce a bit how philosophy at the OCE about what climate change education is. And I'm going to use a bicycle, as you may all know how a bicycle works, as an example and an analogy of climate change education. So a bicycle got two wheels, obviously, and so this analogy comes from a group of educators, researchers in Finland, so analogizing them, but they use the wheel as the way the bike could go up to a hill where a brighter future is. So the two wheels are knowledge for one wheel, and the other one is thinking skills. So the two wheels got the same size, so you see that we need knowledge, but also we need all the thinking skills we can, and we shall put in education, and there we could put critical thinking, numeracy, also creativity. But then the bike can't go without pedals, and the pedals are the action, so putting the children into action, like mitigation, adaptation action, or different way they can contribute to fight climate change in their home school or in the family. So that's very crucial. It's very new in education to talk about behavioral aspects. Then the frame is about the values and how educators and teachers and the schools got the same identity and value towards those questions. And then they can sit on the sit, which is motivation. So how do we teach with creativity or with way of like having the children motivated to learn about climate change is very important. Then you got the handle, is where you want to go, so orientation, what your education wants to achieve. And then you got a little light to go on, because the past might be a bit dark, as we all may know, the future is not that bright, so we might go through quite dark times, but if you got a little light, the bike could be able to, go there. In the light, we can put all the emotions and the creativity and where we can have utopia in a way. So that's also very important and again, very new. So I'll stop there about the analogy, but you can see that in that bike, it's not all about knowledge. It's not all about what a greenhouse effect is and how, greenhouse gases work. It's also about how do you empower children to behave and to get critical thinking and creativity towards those questions. So it's quite a hard job to do as a teacher, and the OC tries to make that bike available for any teacher, let's say. So that's where we stand for, building on resources and having them available for teachers.
Great, thank you so much. And so can you tell us just a little bit more about the work of the ECO? You provide...
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, so more concretely, we provide with free of use resources worldwide. So they're all translated in French, Spanish, German, some of them German, but also English, of course. And so they're the main resources we do for now are based on the IPCC report. So we're an observing member of the IPCC as well. So we've got access to researchers from the IPCC groups, and we work very closely with them. So we start with, say, climate literacy and scientific knowledge, but then we derive more and more with years with more social, humanities and creativity to implement more, say, psychoaffective learning as well as behavioral learning. And that's where we've got this project with Laure. Can talk a bit about that now? Sure. Yeah, cool. So it's a project that we led together with your students. And very briefly for us at the OC, the mission was to find ways to teach about climate change in that little light I was talking to you about. How do we actually have resources for the teachers to talk about how we can fit our society in the future where hope is still there, you know what I mean? So that's where it stands.
Knocking my nameplate off the table there. So maybe we can move on to Laure then, and you can tell us a little bit about that project and why you wanted to be involved in it. Thanks.
Yes, sure. So the project, in fact, was I was happy to work with OCE. First of all, because as Simon said, they are very strong in scientific terms. So it was important for me that my students, they are studying graphic design in a master's degree. I wanted them to have more than vague notions of the global warming. That is, we'll discuss it later, I think, but it's fearful. And it's vague, in fact. We don't know exactly what's happening. So I went for their citizenship. I found it was very interesting to work with an organization like OCE. So that was the first reason why I wanted to gather with Simon and the team. Second reason is that one of the missions of graphic design is to make complex information accessible. So the public of the like children, I found it very thrilling for the students to talk to children and make it accessible to them. And also I wanted to work on some making level, because like nowadays graphic designers work mainly on computers and digital support, supports. And I wanted them to work very low tech on this project, because that's also one of your constraints, that any school everywhere in the world could use the resources. So what we build is usable only with a printing machine, a pair of scissors, and that's it. And like children, and a teacher, of course. And because we made an exhibition with the OCE, and for the exhibition, and we will show you what we did. But we worked with some printing process, which name is risography. Maybe some of you know. It's a very ecological printing process, because the inks are safe in terms of like they are not polluting, they don't contain many chemical stuff. And the graphic result is also very interesting. So it was also an occasion to work on this support. And to speak more about what we did with Simon and the OCE, we decided to project the students, and after them the children, the resources are addressed to. We wanted them to think not so far away in the future. They invented the life in 2042, like when 10 years old children today would be 30, like they would be adults. And how will it be in the cities? How will it be in the countryside? How will it be like to consume? How will we eat in these days? How will we travel for the holiday? And all these stories that my students invented, we asked them to make them positive. We asked them to project them in an optimistic future, which would be realistic also. Like it was not about flying cars and non-feasible things, but regarding the fact there will be climate change, how will we be happy in this context? So that's the stories the students invented, and we can maybe pass them around later.
Yeah, please do. But just before you do, just a point of clarification. So you were working with your students around these kind of visions of the future and producing materials for use in schools, or what was the purpose of the materials that you were producing?
It was made to be used at school, yes. It was, like, as I said before, it's on the website of the OCE with all the resources, and anyone, anywhere in the world can print them and use them. I can show now some of them are need a bit work to make it efficient. But for example, this was about what will be the school of the future. Tu trouves la BD ou pas? Yeah, like the school of the future was first with a comic strip that Simon is finding. A comic strip telling the story of a young girl going to school in 2042 and how it would have changed compared to... here it is. Voilà. So this is the day of Marie. But this is not the first page. Anyway, so that's the comic strip. And then there was a map of how the school and the surrounding looks like. And then there was some activities for the children. And this is where the children get creative. Like the students create a visual universe, and I think we'll talk about it later, how graphic colors give you a feeling of how you can project in a brighter future. And then there were some pictures to complete. Like, for example, this is the classroom, and this is the schoolyard. And there are like stickers to cut and paste so that the children can decide to put like solar panels, a parking for the bicycles, but they could also be a bit less ecological and decide to make a heated pool. And this is the base of a discussion, because at the end there are some points, like pollution points related to each item you choose to put in your schoolyard or in your classroom. And then we realize that some things are increasing the global warming, some things are making it more less strong. Thank you. And this is the base of a discussion, and it helps the children to think about how they want things to be in the future. And this is the beginning of a political discussion about how collectively we want things to be.
Thank you so much for sharing that practical example, and do feel free to pass the materials around. And maybe whilst you do that, we'll turn to Lennart. So perhaps two questions for you. Basically, can you tell us a bit more about your work and how it relates to creativity and education? And then maybe could you give us some practical examples of some of the, what that involves on the ground?
Of course, thank you, Cassie, and it's great to be here. So I'm Lennart from Teach for All. Just a few quick words about Teach for All. So we're a global organization and a network of 61 so-called network partners. These are independent national organizations that are all cultivating leadership so that all students are able to fulfill their potential. And the way that our network partners work in these 61 countries is that they all recruit and then train outstanding graduates and professionals from all different subject areas to commit 2 years of teaching in their own nation's most under-resourced communities and schools. And after those 2 years of teaching, those fellows who are then becoming alumni are then becoming part of our global network. And what's fascinating is that most of them, after the 2 years of teaching, decide to spend a lifetime in the field of education, even though they initially started from all different kinds of directions. And just to give you a dimension, we currently have 14,000 teachers in the schools in those 61 countries, and we have roughly 90,000 alumni in those 61 countries, out of which 70% are still in education. My job as the global head of climate education within that global network is really to respond to what I would call a devastating status quo of climate education globally. I think it's a story in 6 different phases. The first one is climate change is real. Climate change is a reality for children all over the world, and for many of them it's not climate change anymore, it's everything change, it's everywhere change. The second part is it fundamentally matters because it shapes their current and it shapes their future. And it increases the unpredictability of situations, and it also increases the fragility of many of the contexts. The third thing is that children realize that. Children want us to do more. But then the fourth part is coming in that says schools are not doing much about climate change currently. There was a study by UNICEF and by UNESCO that found that only roughly half of all national curricula even make mention of climate change and of environmental sustainability. And the fifth part, when we come to the perspective of teachers, is that there was a study of 58,000 teachers that found 95% of those teachers want to teach about climate change in their schools, but only about 40% of them feel ready to do that. So that is a fifth part. And then the sixth part, I would say, is that there's very strong lobbies that push for a maintenance of the status quo that we currently see. And there's also very limiting mindsets. We talked a lot about mindsets when we had the case study conversations today. There's a mindset that still the teacher has to know everything before engaging students in learning. How about we flip that and we talk about something that's called teaching as collective leadership, where students and teacher together engage in conversation and in learning that's problem-based and that is collective. So within that sort of status quo, I think what we need is we need strong leadership at all levels to advance climate education across the board. And given the many constraints that I've just mentioned, I think creativity has to be at the forefront of all of that. Creativity in the classroom. Currently, when there's no curricular space, climate change is not part of the learning objectives. Teachers have to be very creative in order to make this work. And we just heard one great example of doing that, integrating it into different subject areas that can be math, geography, linguistics, different other subject areas. We also need creativity at other levels, teacher training, policy, innovation. And my work is really to try to work with that whole global network at Teach for All to try to spark that leadership on different levels. And we do that in 3 ways. We do that first of all by providing training and materials. We've just launched what we call a resource hub for climate education materials as Teach for All, where we curated about 180 freely accessible resources for climate education, ranging from lesson plans to teacher training tools to many more learning materials. We also build a community. We have what we call the Global Climate Education Community at Teach for All, where we already have 500 teachers that are coming together once a month to learn about climate change, education, learn from each other, share their experiences and insights. And we also try to influence the global conversation around climate education. So, for example, at the beginning of December, we're going to be at the Global Climate Change Conference with 17 teachers from across our network. And they're going to speak in many of the different panels, and they're going to represent the teacher voice and what needs to happen at the policy level, so to make the curriculum space, to provide funding, to provide materials, and to address other barriers. So you asked for examples as well of what are some of the teachers doing that we are seeing in the network. Maybe I can just give you 2 examples very quickly. So I work with a teacher in Kenya, for example. She teaches in a context that is seeing the impacts of climate change in the sense that food and water are becoming increasingly scarce. So she's working with her students in a school gardening project. They have, together with the community, managed to get a borehole for the school where they can get water. They also have built out of recycled materials water conservation tanks for the schools. The food that they're growing, the water that they're getting through the borehole and through the water conservation is providing a school feeding program. So in a way it becomes a cycle where the climate education that that teacher is doing, embedded in explaining very clearly why the community is facing water shortages, food shortages, is then becoming an instance of school building, where you connected with food systems, where you connected with school feeding, water provision. We have one example of a teacher in Germany who tries to make students' ecological footprint very tangible for students. So he invented what he calls the CO2 footprint projects, where students put their own objects, depending on what kind of consumption choices they make, together in a little bag, and then they feel how heavy it is. So they get a sense very tangibly of what is their own ecological footprint. And what they then did as a next step was that they, as the class, assessed the footprint of the school, and then wrote a little letter to the headmaster to assess, together with the headmaster, how can the school reduce the footprint. So it is taking students to go from a tangible individual level awareness to then building collective action and collective awareness.
Thank you. I was really struck by what you said for 2 reasons. One, there's a kind of difficulty of getting climate education on the agenda and in the curriculum and into schools in the first place, and then the difficulty of being creative and critical within that climate education. And the statistic that you shared, that 90% of teachers want to get involved in climate education, but only 40% feel ready. Why do you think that is? What are the constraints? What are the difficulties? And what are the, maybe we can actually start with you guys. What are the constraints that you found in your project? And then we can move on to Lennart with the same question.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are like different levels of constraints in that sense, or barriers, I would say. And again, to go back to the bike before, bikes got brakes, and also the brakes are like actually good in a way, but also they're quite bad, because if you want that bike and therefore all society and climate change education to go on, we need to identify those brakes and those barriers and try to cut them down. And for me, and the OCE is trying to reduce those brakes. One of the main issues actually to provide, as you said, like to get the teachers ready. So the question of curriculum is very important, and the UNESCO is working a lot on, I mean, there are like movement worldwide to increase notions of climate change and what we call greening education on curricula around the world, and OCE is lucky to work on that. I'm working on developing parts of curriculum guidance on ecology, actually, where we want not only knowledge but also behavior and social emotional learning to be very present, and therefore so that's one brick, let's say, to have like a strong curriculum. So we need first examples of curricula that works already, like evidence-based curricula from different countries, and gathering different people working on that field to produce like a guidance, and then having a country to actually implement that. So implementation of curricula is another project where also we can have a lot of barriers, because it's all about politics at some point. And talking lobbying that just wants the status quo to stay. So I think there is like, collective action towards like increasing policies towards stronger curricula in climate change education. But then we can't do only with curricula. We need to get space for the teachers and to get resources and so time and efforts for the teachers to be trained and to have the right, capacity and so on. So we need definitely to have strong policies towards like teacher training protocols, like pre-service and post-service trainings that are like good quality. And finally, and that was actually in the UNESCO report you were talking about, there is a lack of good quality and free of use resources. And that's where the OCE is actually working a lot. So we provide free and available on our website resources from good quality content, which is IPCC report at first, and then now with, working with creative people and working on those field of creativity with like educators and so on. So for me, like those barriers are definitely not easy to overcome, but that's where I'm very happy to work on with OCE.
Thank you. And Laure, as a teacher, albeit for master's students, kind of facilitating this project, trying to get your students to be creative about this challenge of producing pedagogical resources, what are the kind of barriers and constraints, but also some of the successes that you encountered?
The main barrier that we could move easily with OCE was scientific knowledge they didn't have. So that's why it was important for me to back with a very strong content, scientific content that we could base on. So once the OCE provided with all the resources we needed, we could focus on the creative side. So the creativity in design studies is not such a problem, actually. So they could be creative, but the challenge for them was to produce resources that would make the children creative. It was not just only telling a story, it was also bringing the children they are talking to, creating at their turn their own story. And to make it feasible, because we tested all the resources with the children and it was a huge success. What they did is that they built their content in two parts. First part was the graphic universe and the story. Like, for example, I showed you the story of the girl going to school, but there are 8 stories in total. One of them that I like a lot is the travel. So there is a character traveling in a big drawn landscape, and it's poetic in terms of drawing, but also there are some line of text. Sorry, it's in French, but evoking the travel, and it's very tiny stories happening all around the way, and all around the way there are postcards that are there to be cut, and at the back you have the stories of what's happening in this huge landscape that I just showed. And reading the postcards, the children focus their attention, and this is related to that part of the global illustration, and it makes them also invent things that are not maybe on the picture, but they create other pictures in the head. And then there is a small workshop of postcards writing and also postcard drawing, depending on what the children feel the most at ease. And so all these stories that my students build are like the beginning of something that the pupils can make their own and create at their turn. So this is one example, and there are other displays that the students invented.
Thank you. And then turning to you and thinking specifically around sort of integrating creativity into climate education, what do you think are some of the challenges for teachers, but also some of the ways to overcome those challenges?
So first of all, I agree with everything that Simon and Laure shared, so I'm not going to repeat that. I think 3 aspects that are really central to me are, first of all, when I speak to teachers in our network about their barriers to integrating climate education in their teaching, I hear 3 main things. There's a lack of knowledge. They're lacking the knowledge because it's not part of the teacher training. The second is there's a lack of confidence. It's such a big, impermeable issue that it's just very hard for them to come to grips with it. And the third thing is feeling of permission. People don't feel permitted to address climate change in their classroom because they're unresolved about their own ecological footprint, about their own behaviors with regard to climate change. So these are 3 barriers with regard to teacher readiness. The other aspect is around mindset. I mentioned one aspect of mindset, which is very much a teacher has to know it all before being able to teach about something. Flipping that upside down is very hard, where it's much more around collective leadership. The second aspect around mindset is in many schools, teachers are faced with the response, yes, climate change is important, but so is foundational learning. Please, first of all, get students ready on their writing, reading, and math skills. That is also fundamentally misled, because the idea is not to have a new subject called climate change and make everything climate change. The idea is to integrate it into math, into writing, into reading, so that students learn in a way that's very applicable and that's very tangible for them to apply to their own context and to their own lives. So I think that's the mindset thing that is a key barrier that we need to address. The third thing is inspiration is lacking. There isn't so much in terms of good examples of what's possible for climate education. Something that we've just started doing is to put together an online repository of 100 teacher-led climate education solutions to spark the imagination, to spark the creativity, to spark the inspiration of teachers all over the world to say, you don't have to be the lone warrior in your context figuring it all by yourself out, and that's also what OECD is doing. But here are some examples, here are some resources, here are some great inspirations for how you can do this, and here's ways how you can connect with others. because that's also a key barrier. You're often the lone warrior and you're fighting against a certain status quo that says, let's not get too ambitious here.
Okay, last question from me, and then I'll perhaps open it up to the rest of the room. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about critical thinking. Obviously, you know, whether you think about the ability of students to differentiate between high impact and low impact solutions, whether you think about the relationship between individual agency and collective agency, the ability to kind of think about whose interests at the, you know, are being served, and that kind of unequal effects of climate change. It feels like critical thinking is a key part of climate education, but can you give some sort of practical examples of how teachers can go about integrating critical thinking into climate education as a sort of, you know, alongside creativity? I don't know. Yeah, Simon.
Yeah, maybe I can start with it. The experience we have with the teacher training we do, so we've got a specific teacher training protocol, like a session of like half a day on critical thinking based on a role play game, just to get acquainted with the biases, psychological biases climate denial can use to you know, ingrain and say climate change doesn't exist and so on. And teachers actually saying that, at least in France, it's very rare that we've got debate anymore with the students, but that helps out anyways to debunk like other, as you said, like other aspects of like now climate change. I mean, there is no climate denials or very few in classrooms, but now the questions of society choices is the new, say, aspect of debate and where we need critical thinking. And the answer to that is maybe not to go very frontal, but more to, in any teaching, as you said before, in math or in other like society questions, to have a bit of critical thinking aspects every now and then, like having habits to the children. It's like a muscle you need to, you know, play with, like having, you know, bringing habits towards like what's the source of this information, or how do you read the graphic, or something like that. Like in any field of education will help when you go on with a very specific question where critical thinking is important. And the other aspect I wanted to share with you is like in this project, another aspect I found quite interesting to play around a bit with critical thinking is the fact that we asked the students, the graphic design students, to have in their stories characters that just are in the future in a place where there is no question anymore about if it's right or good, but it's actually there. Like say, plant-based diet is not a question anymore in 2042. It's just like their daily life is based on that as well. So it's a quite interesting way of like putting students where, look, let's imagine a world where there is no debate anymore. It's like the way it is, because based on the IPCC report, for instance, that should be one of a key element of our collective action towards mitigation of climate change. So let's imagine what's happening if it's actually happening. And I find it quite interesting because that makes the students just like feel, okay, well, that's normal. In that story, it's normal, so why not should we use it? So it's a bit like flipping the question about critical thinking, because, and that's an aspect that is quite interesting to think as well in the media community. Like, how do you make the use, but also like anyone, you know, wanting something, which when the status quo is like to make you feel like you need to consume and so on. Maybe if we just like, you know, put more stories around like you can live a life in that way and it's still good and still attractive, then the question of like, should we do it or not is maybe less of a question.
Okay, interesting. So almost instead of questioning everything, thinking about situations in which there are certain things we can't question anymore. Yeah. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts on critical thinking?
Yes, maybe just an illustration of what Simon said. One of the projects was Life in the City in 2042. And I really like this project because the students were very mature in terms of displaying the controversial subjects that could happen. Like there was a character that was more into building, and he wanted to build. It's very happening now with the Olympic Games in Paris. But he wanted to build some hotel in a park that was some biodiversity. A park that had some biodiversity importance for many inhabitants, human and non-humans of the city, and there were. All the story was discussions between these characters having different interests in this situation, and the part involving the children was a debate game where they could embody some character, and there would be subjects like what topics were discussed, for example.
I think it was like a role play kind of thing around the use of the park, or if it's like, how would you choose, as a character who, like, you've got interests as a character, how would you defend your interest? And it was interesting when we tested it in classroom, like the students were really, like the children playing it were really much like passionate about it and end up being like, well, this character is very bad, and this, like, there's a lot of judgment, like the values are very important, and I think it was very well done in a way that it was not black and white.
No. Yes, it was not black and white, and they were forced, because they would embody the character, to understand why they would think that way, and understand it's very complex situation that need to be collectively solved. It's just not only about me doing my compost or putting the paper in the paper bin. It's collectively how we can organize and think about making a society with the new constraints.
Oh yeah, and just to finish on, like, I remember now, like one of the rules actually, it was like they were having more points, like they were like winning more if they were having like a consensus in terms of like resolving one question. So if they were like not agreeing at all, and one party was having it, there are like less points than having it as a whole group.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. And moving on to you.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the notion of individual versus collective responsibility, because this is such a tricky one to deal with climate education. So there's a rule that says individual action is good but not sufficient. And I think we can open many more boxes here. We can talk about the need for individual action for students to feel self-efficacy, to feel agency, because there's also a massive issue of eco-anxiety. And it's been psychologically proven that if students feel a kind of agency over being able to do something, then that lowers their feeling of eco-anxiety and about feeling concerned and afraid about their future. So individual action, good but not sufficient. We shouldn't give students the notion that if we all would recycle, we would solve the climate crisis. So it then goes into sort of the notion of critical thinking. We need to give them enough knowledge to be informed citizens, to make informed consumption choices, to make informed voting choices, to have some kind of resilience to populist solutions around certain things. We need to give them enough climate literacy to understand what solutions have what impact, what actions have what impact. And ultimately, it's really about building student agency. It's about building student leadership so that, it's a lifelong kind of effect, and it connects to what they have around them, and they can make sense. It's a sense-making exercise that we're ultimately wanting to get students through. And that's, of course, heavily linked to critical thinking. But I just wanted to open that box of saying eco-anxiety being probably the most predominant issue when we talk to students about climate change, individual action being something important to address that and to give self-efficacy and agency in the first notion, but then collective action really being the only way ultimately to address climate change.
Thank you. Yeah, really important to remember. So can I open the floor to questions from the room? Please use your... Yeah. Wonderful. So I see we have one at the back. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Really fascinating session. So I do have a question, but before that, I just wanted to get something off my chest, if I may. So this morning, I didn't join the session this morning because I was in a meeting at work at my museum where I had pitched with some sort of confidence an exhibition about a co-designed exhibition with young people aged 11 to 14 about the role of design in climate change. And we couldn't raise the funds for the exhibition. It was green light or not this morning, so we got no. However, because we just couldn't convince enough funders that this was a really important, that the defining issue of children's lives was the most important subject for young V&A to do an exhibition on. So, wow. But that's fine, because I found another space and we're going to do a small display, and then I want to do a really amazing climate education, creativity and design programme. So we'll find some other people that want to fund us, but for slightly less. So it really resonated, that point that I think Lennart made around, I don't know, that teachers not perhaps having a lack of knowledge or confidence, but it's not just teachers, it's business as well. It's people with the money that don't want to invest in climate education, which is kind of baffling. And so there's obviously a big piece of work to be done at policy sort of beyond education, but obviously within education. So that's the first thing. I was kind of really devastated this morning, and I've picked myself up and was like, no, we're going to do something brilliant. Anyway, but I'm annoyed and baffled. So my question is, I'm reading that brilliant book, What We Owe the Future. Can't remember who it's by, but it's all about long-termism and this idea that with young people, we do need to work around what can be done now. I really agree, agency, individual agency and sort of policy, etc. But to what extent do you think it's even feasible to introduce concepts of long-termism, the billions of humans who don't yet exist, whose rights we should also respect, and try and create a planet and a future for them, as well as for us? Or do you think that when we're working with children, then actually it's the sort of immediate that gives more tangibility to their understanding about having a sort of sense of agency? I don't know that I've worded that very well, but...
Thank you. Before you respond, we'll actually take the other two questions as well, and then we'll respond to all of them. So try to hold that in your head. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so just tapping into what you were saying around eco-anxiety and managing the conversation within a realistic context, could you shed some light on how you host those conversations, discussing the fact that, the oil industry or the banks that are investing in fossil fuels perpetuate the power dynamics that we're seeing that creates this resistance to understanding how we can make change regarding climate change, and also the disparity of experience with the global south and how the impact that they're experiencing is so palpable and present. And for us, it can be quite... we have the privilege of delving into this topic in a way that feels more distant, and we're not experiencing the mass floods or having to deal with our resources being pummeled and then used in mobile phones and all technology all around the world and things like that. So how do you manage those conversations, and is it that you make use of the network that you have, the different schools and things, and the kind of global presence that you have? Is there opportunity for kind of comparison of experience and conversation between those projects and groups? I just wanted to know a bit about that.
There is kind of paradox between creativity and consciousness, because the whole time you are speaking about climate changing, but we have a big problem also with pollution, and for times there is a lot of sick and dead people because of pollution. We will be dead of pollution before climate change, but you continue to say to child, okay, let's concentrate on climate change. And we need to help child to have big consciousness. I am not sure there is a link between critical thinking and system thinking, because in system thinking they can watch this kind of problem. This is what I am fear about.
Okay, so lots of big questions there. Lennart, do you want to start?
Yeah, first of all, I want to share the rant in the beginning. So let's look at the funding landscape in climate change. It's mostly going towards technology. There's still the belief that tomorrow we're going to find the silver bullet, and we're just going to technologize our way out of it. That's not going to happen. So there's going to be increasing attention towards these challenges, climate education. How do we build societal consensus around it? So I'm hopeful together with you that all the funding crunch that all of us are experiencing constantly is going to be relieved a little in the coming years, because there's an understanding that technology is not going to fix the whole problem for us, and we're just going to continue the way we do. Your question on the long-termism, I think we need a sense of deeper learning with students, and the first part in that is reconnecting them with the natural environment around us. Kids don't really understand anymore where the food is coming from. Kids don't understand that we are fundamentally not saving the natural environment, we're fundamentally saving ourselves. This is about our own water, our own food, our own shelter, our own stable climate that allows us to live and to thrive. So building that reconnection of children, I think, is a really, really important first step in this matrix. And just quickly on the second question, around eco-anxiety, and I think taking students seriously and providing a space for them to talk about these issues is the first step in tapping into that. And in our experience in our network, when teachers open up, admit that they are not fully resolved about it, they're equally fallible, that provides a really powerful discussion together with students, and then building student agency in the next step, that they feel they can do something, at least locally, about the issue, is really, really important in addressing eco-anxiety. And that taps into the second aspect you mentioned, which is, not every context is the same. And I think that's super important to recognize. Climate education needs to be highly contextual. If we take a classroom in Kenya or in Zimbabwe, for example, we need to talk about many other issues than what we need to talk about in Germany, for example. And the teachers, for example, talk mostly about local adaptation. How can we as local societies get more resilient to the impacts that we are already witnessing? In the German classroom, it's much more about what is our responsibility as Germany for global warming. So that is heavily sort of mitigation. How do we lower emissions? How do we build green skills in order to green our economy and so on conversation? And what we do in the global network is that we have this community of 500 teachers growing, that come together all the time, sharing those experiences and sharing the individual, but then collective experiences of how to do that. But it is looking different everywhere. It is locally rooted and is contextual. That's super important.
I couldn't agree more on what you say, Lennart, and to answer those questions as well are the same feeling. And the first question about long-termism, and I think that's quite a tricky question that goes with child development as well. Like we know that early child and like up to teenagehood, they got a less sense of abstraction and also of time. And for them, when we do, so we've got an activity that we developed around climate emotions. So how do you feel about climate change with like sort of emotion cards and so on. And so we played that, we did that activity with like younger children and then with like middle school and then high school. And we found out that the children in primary school, their time sense is very hard to pick. And for them, it's like the next big step will be Christmas, for instance, or will be like next holiday time. And having them think, how do you feel when you'll be, like 20 years old and so on, is so abstract that they might go on with either hyper-anxiety or either just nothing. And when you ask them, 90% of the time when they're feeling anxious, it's because there is like an overestimation of the risk. So it's very important as well to get those questions as well very early on, because even so, we can protect in a way by having good quality climate change education, targeting age groups, and as you say, reconnecting with nature is very important, especially in early ages. But media or discussion with the family will have impact on their, sense of comprehension of what climate change is. So it's very important as well to have the space of understanding where the emotions come from and to have them rethink a bit with critical thinking about, actually, no, the planet Earth won't explode in 5 years of time. We go back to what greenhouse effect is because we saw it in class before. So that was my first point of like, long-termism, I think, is very important, but it's very hard to do that early on. They can still put some bricks in there. And then what you were talking about, it's interesting because at DOC we work with different parts of the world, and that activity about the emotion of climate change, we do it a lot in teacher training protocol. And we've got the same sense as you mentioning, Lennart, of if teachers are not okay with their own emotions, then they're not ready neither to deal with the children's emotion. So it's quite important as well to have that sense of how do you feel as a practitioner about your anxiety as well. And it's so interesting because in any country there are the same discussion. First discussions are about like, look, we got floods. Like back in the day, we used to talk about weather, right? When we don't know what to talk about, we would talk about weather. And nowadays, like in any country we're going, we start to talk about how extreme event affected family of such or such. And we've got like in Mexico there was about drought in Veracruz, and then in Kenya it would be about bushfires or something. And like in Canada it was about bushfires. I was there like a month ago, and like every discussion we have. So we've got also a sense of community because we're all facing the same issue. So that's also something that brings that global community together. But then you've got also obviously context dependent. There are more to me. There are more to do with economically resilience as well. And there's this study done in 2021 by Marx et al. That was the first attempt to have a global temperature about eco-anxiety in the world. So they did a survey on 10,000 young adults from 16 to 24 years old, asking them how do they feel about climate change in different countries, and then asking them how that feeling is affecting their daily life, about going to sleep, about focusing, and so on. And there is a huge difference between, so basically the first results are showing that there is more than 40% of the responses were about we feel anxious or super anxious about climate. And then the question about how do you feel, how does that affect your daily life? In the countries, let's say the developing countries, and also countries in the intertropical area where there is more effect of climate change already, there were like twice as much as impact on their daily life rather than in developing countries. And that's an example of climate justice as well, because their own mental health is affected as well because of lack of resilience of the country itself. So taking that into account as well is very important when you do that activity in countries where there is already this big impact on mental health.
Thank you. Laure, we have 1 minute left. Do you want to? No. Okay. Well, in that case, let me just thank you all. I think that was a really interesting panel. We moved from kind of practical examples and the materiality of actually sharing material produced by students to examples from around the world, to eco-anxiety. So really interesting. And please help me, everyone, in thanking our panel.